Chapter 1 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Beyond Utopia. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 1. A Letter from the Dead. There were masses of black clouds in the grey evening sky, and a misty darkness brooded over the shoulder of the moor, as the barouche, with its fine upstanding greys, came swinging round the curve of the road leading to Callander Castle, a more luxurious carriage than is generally to be met with on a Cumbrian moor. But this carriage belonged to a lady whose importance filled the land to the farthest limit of moor and valley, and away to the edge of yonder distant sea, whose leaden waves were edged with livid spray at the sunset hour of a stormy October afternoon. The lady, Sybil, Countess of Penrith, was sitting alone in her carriage, wrapped in dark fur, with a proud, clearly cut face showing pale between the sable of her close-fitting toque and the sable collar of her velvet mantle. Her eyes had a dreamy look as they surveyed the desolate landscape, the undulating sweep of moorland, the distant grey of the sea. The droop of the sensitive lips suggested mournful thoughts, or it might be only a pensive reverie in harmony with the sullen atmosphere and the dark monotony of the landscape. Suddenly, out of the very ground, as it seemed to Lady Penrith, a rough-looking man came running after the carriage. The footman looked round at him as if he had been a dog, and took no further heed than he would have taken of a dog. The coachman drove steadily on, touching the muscular shoulders of the sleek greys daintily with the point of his whip, quickening the pace as the sky darkened. The man came running on, giving chase to the carriage, and waving an arm in a ragged fustian sleeve. "Stop!" cried Lady Penrith, and the coachman pulled up his horses in the midst of the bleak, bare moor, and the footman alighted from the box and came to the carriage door, touching his hat with gloved fingers, mute image of obedience and subserviency. "That man wants to speak to me," said her ladyship. "Wait." The vagabond's footsteps grew near. He was at the carriage door in less than 3 minutes, breathless and hoarsely panting, with a sound like the grating of rusty iron. He looked like a shepherd out of employment, ragged, gaunt, hungry-eyed. "Are you Lady Penrith?" he asked. "Yes," answered her ladyship, with her purse open in her hand, having only one idea as to the man's motive in following her carriage. Beggars were rare on that moorland road, but this man was evidently a beggar, she thought, and not being a political economist, her first impulse was to relieve him. He never said a word, but fumbled under the ragged shirt which hardly hid his lean breast, and produced a folded scrap of paper, which he flung into the lady's lap, then turned and ran away, across the moor this time, as fast as he had run after the carriage 3 minutes before. "Follow him," said Lady Penrith to the footman, and the footman went tripping and stumbling under and over the stony moor, nearly falling down at every second step. The hungry vagabond vanished into the dim grey of evening before the overfed lackey in his buckled shoes had gone 50 yards across that uneven ground. He came back, breathlessly apologetic, and explained the impossibility of catching a man who ran like a rabbit. "Do you know who he is, or Where he comes from? No, my lady. Never saw him before, to my knowledge. There is no village in that direction nearer than Cargill, and that is 3 miles off. He must have come from Cargill, I suppose. A beggar, no doubt. That will do, James. Home. Home. The word, how often soever she might pronounce it, had always a sound of irony in her ear. What likeness was there between the English ideal of home and Killander Castle on the Cumbrian moorland, or Penrith House, Berkeley Square, or the Mimosas at Cannes, or the Den near Braemar, or any habitation owned by Archibald, Earl of Penrith? There are men and women who can create an atmosphere of domestic peace in a log hut in the Australian bush, or in a lodging house at the East End of London. There are others who, among a dozen palaces, cannot make one home. A pale streak of yellow light on the western edge of the moor showed where the sun had dipped below the horizon. A colder wind blew from the far-off sea, and Lady Penrith shivered as she took up the scrap of soiled paper from her lap and held it gingerly with the tips of her gloved fingers. It was less than half a sheet of notepaper. There were only a few pencilled words in 4 straggling lines along the paper, and those few words were so difficult to decipher that Lady Penrith had to pore over them for a long time in the waning light before she made them into the following sentences. Out of the grave, the living grave, a long forgotten voice calls to you, where their worm dieth not, and their fire is not quenched. No signature, no indication of from whom or whence the message came. A madman's scrawl, no doubt, inspired by some half-cloudy purpose in the troubled brain of lunacy. The ragged wretch whom she had taken for a beggar was doubtless some wandering lunatic, harmless, and therefore permitted to ramble about the countryside. A religious enthusiast, perhaps. The scrap of scripture pointed that way. Lady Penrith resolved to drive to Cargill next day and search out the history of the writer, if indeed he lived there, as seemed likely, unless he were to be found in one of those lonely cottages scattered here and there over the face of the moor, between Penrith and Arliston, the little seaport whence coal and iron were shipped for the south. A great tract of wild country, broken only by small and solitary hamlets, lay between these 2 points. The coal mines and smelting works and miners' villages all lay northward of Ardliston. The landscape on this southward side of the harbour was wild and gloomy, but had a certain stern beauty of its own, and was not disfigured by mining operations of any kind. Lady Penrith was interested in the troubled mind which had prompted that pencil scrawl. A call to repentance, no doubt, such as a summons as the pauper Puritan, seeking rank and beauty, rolled by in a 300-guinea barouche, not unseldom feels himself called upon to deliver. There was really nothing to wonder at. There was hardly anything exceptional in the incident, unless perhaps it were that the man should have been there in the nick of time, as her ladyship's carriage went by. Yet even that circumstance was easy enough to understand if he were an inhabitant of the district. She drove in that direction often, and as a person of mark in the neighbourhood, her habits were doubtless noted and known. No, there was nothing curious in the incident, nothing worthy of much thought, and yet she thought of nothing else during her homeward drive. She carried the thought with her under the great grey gateway with its iron portcullis, and into the hall where the atmosphere of smouldering logs and hothouse flowers had a feeling as of the warm, sweet South she knew so well, and up to her own sitting-room, where the slip of soiled paper lay on her lap as she sipped her solitary cup of tea. His lordship and his lordship's friends had been out shooting all day. Her niece, a niece by courtesy, had gone with the luncheon cart, and the lady of Killander Castle had the great medieval fortress all to herself in the October gloaming. Presently she drew the lamp nearer and scrutinised that pencilled scrawl even more closely than before in the bright white light. "It is not the writing of an uneducated man," she said to herself, and then her head sank lower as her elbow rested on the cushioned arm of her chair, until her forehead almost touched the slip of paper on the table in front of her. She sat there some minutes, lost in dreamy thought. How strange that the hand should be like his, she murmured, and then, after a pause, "Is it really like, or do I fancy a resemblance because he is so often in my thoughts?" Then another lapse into reverie. "He was not in my mind to-day. I had other things to think of. I was brooding on the hard realities of life, not upon its losses and regrets." She took up the paper, studied again, noting its every stroke of the pencil. "It is like the writing of the dead," she said at last with conviction. "The hand which wrote was the hand of a gentleman. I must hunt out the writer. I shall not rest until I find out who and what he is. A madman, no doubt, but should he be in poverty and distress, I should like to help him, if it were only because he writes like the dead." She rose and went across the room to the large old-fashioned escritoire, where most of her letters were written, and among numerous pigeonholes and quaint recesses there were 2 deep drawers provided with Brahma locks. She unlocked one of these and dropped the scrap of paper on the top of the neatly arranged packets of letter, tied with different coloured ribbons. Letters which were in some wise the record of a woman's life. There was one of these packets, the thinnest of them, tied with a broad black ribbon. Lady Penrith stood for a minute or two with the drawer open, looking down at those letters bound with the black band. Then she slowly closed the drawer and locked it, and as she turned away from the escritoire, her eyes were dim with tears. That fancied resemblance in a handwriting had been like the lifting of a coffin lid for one last look at the dead face underneath. All the passion and the despair of a long buried past had come back to Sibyl Penrith at the bidding of an unknown lunatic who happened to write like the man to whom she had given her girlish heart, 10 years ago. She was sitting in her low chair by the fire in the shadow of a tall Indian screen when the door opened suddenly and an exuberant young woman came noisily into the room and brought the dreamer back in an instant from the past with its fond regrets to the present with its manifold obligations. "Ah, such a day!" cried the newcomer. "You are better off even in your dreary afternoon drive. I had to wait, and wait, and wait for those men until I was absolutely ravenous, and the hot dishes were utterly spoiled. I shall never go out with the luncheon cart again, unless I have 3 or 4 pretty girls to back me up. Those selfish wretches would be punctual enough then, but they don't mind reducing poor plain me to the verge of starvation." "Poor plain Cora," said her ladyship, as the girl seated herself at the tea-table and began a spirited attack upon the cakes and buns which Lady Penrith had left untasted. "Girls who really think themselves plain don't talk about it. They live in the hope that it is a secret between themselves and their looking-glasses." "Oh, but I am an exception to your rule," protested Miss Urquhart, with her large serviceable mouth full of Scotch bun. "When I was 12 years old I found out the difference between beauty and ugliness. I heard all the pretty little girls admired. Such blue eyes, such long lashes, such dear little mouths, such lily and rose complexions, and such lovely golden hair. Well, I observed that people called me good, or clever, or sensible, as if any girl wanted to be called sensible. So I looked steadily at my image in the glass, and I faced the unpleasant fact. 'You are plain, Coralie,' I said to myself, 'unmistakably plain. You have tolerable eyes, and good teeth, but your nose is a failure. Your complexion is pallid, and your mouth is just twice too large for prettiness. Never forget that you are plain, my dear Coralie, and then perhaps other people won't remember the fact quite so often. Shake hands with fate. Accept your thick nose and your pallid complexion as the stern necessities of your existence, and make the most of your eyes and teeth, and your average head of hair.' That is the gist of what I said to myself, in less sophisticated language, perhaps, before I was 15, and from that line of conduct I have never departed. So if I have come to 19 years of age without being admired, at least I have escaped being laughed at." "You are a bright, clever girl, Cora, and have quite enough good looks to float your cleverness, and to win you plenty of attention of your sex." "Do you really mean that?" asked Miss Urquhart, turning a pair of keen brown eyes upon Lady Penrith. "Well, you, who are among the handsomest of your sex, can afford to be generous. The men are civil enough to me, certainly, and I believe some of them like me, in a way, as a jolly good fellow, don't you know." "I think you ought to leave off being a jolly good fellow, Cora, and remember that you are a young lady now. Your 20th birthday is drawing near," said her ladyship with kindly seriousness. "What? Leave off cigarettes and horsey talk, forego my morning fun in the stables and kennels, and give the billiard-room a holiday, and take to embroidering window curtains, and reading the last book of the Honourable Somebody's Travels in Timbuktu? So I would, auntie, if I could only make up my mind which line is likely to pay best in such a case as mine. The well-brought-up, stand-offish young lady, or the free and easy young person whom her male acquaintances talk to as good fun, or not a bad sort. Perhaps you will explain what you mean by paying best. Oh, I'm sure you catch my meaning. Which line will bring me the most eligible offer of marriage? That is the question. Of course, there is a sprinkling of proper-minded young men, the cream of the peerage and the landed gentry, who could only be won by a proper-minded young woman. But I doubt if among those chosen ones there is a chance for such as I, and I have observed that the ruck of young men prefer the society of a girl who is distinctly on their own level, a little below them rather than a little above. That is why chorus girls and barmaids often get on so well in the world. Ah, Cora, what a pity! You should have learnt so much about the seamy side of life. Yes, that comes of being brought up by a father instead of a mother. Had my mother lived, she would have reared me in a state of guileless innocence. I should have thought burlesque boys and pantomime fairies a kind of semi-angelic creatures, and I should never have learned of a barmaid. Whereas the governor used to entertain me with the gossip of the clubs every morning at breakfast, the only meal he took at home. My poor Coralie! And your father, pray, don't call him governor, taught you that your mission in life is to marry? Well, if I can. Badly, if I can't. At any rate, to get myself some kind of husband, so as to take myself off the paternal hands. At least, that was his idea a year or two ago. Now that you are so good to me, and let me be here and in Berkeley Square, he is no longer so keen on my marrying. So long as I don't worry or burden him with, he is satisfied. But when you grow tired of me— I'm not going to tire of you, Cora. I mean to grow fonder of you, if you will let me. Let you? Why, I worship you. You are my ideal of all that is perfect in woman. If the leopard could change his spots, I would prove my sincerity by trying to be like you, in grace and dignity and high and pure thoughts. Lady Penrith acknowledged these compliments with a sigh. Oh, I know you have only a poor opinion of yourself. You don't know half how good you are. Good? I am nothing, Cora. I am a passive nonentity, a piece of human furniture that fills an allotted space in Lord Penrith's establishment, and which is of no importance in the world either for good or evil. That is hard, ain't it? Sighed Coralie. With your beauty, you ought to have done as much harm as Cleopatra. You ought to have seen fleets destroyed and armies slaughtered for your beaux yeux, and kept 2 kingdoms in commotion, like Mary Stuart. Or even in these degenerate modern times, you might have set the town in a blaze, been the cause of separations and divorces, Belgian duels and Mayfair suicides. With such beauty and such wealth as yours, to be only Lady Penrith? No, it is not so much after all. And yet, how many people envy you? I myself, for instance. I hope you are above so paltry a feeling, Cora. No, don't hope anything exalted or noble of my father's daughter, said Coralie, renewing her attack upon a pile of crisp biscuits and munching as she talked. I don't like to hear a daughter speak of her father as you speak of yours, Cora, Lady Penrith said gravely. and I would much rather you left his name out of our conversation. You ought to remember that he and I have long ceased to be friends." I ought," cried Cora. "I am a wretch to forget." And then she put down her biscuit and sighed remorsefully. "It was so good of you to rescue me from my shabby, lonely life. It was so good of you to forget that I am Hubert Urquhart's daughter." "You are my husband's niece. That gives you a claim upon me, Cora." "There are hundreds of women who would laugh such a claim to scorn. And you have plenty of girls of your own blood to care for, those nice Hammond girls who are devoted to you." "They are very good girls, but they have a mother to look after them. And I was motherless and alone, educated in a second-rate school kept by a needy Frenchwoman in a shabby suburb beyond the Bois de Boulogne, eating my heart out in a dingy lodging-house which had but one virtue, that it was near my father's favourite clubs. Oh, how I hated that dark, narrow street under the shadow of St. James's Church, and the joy bells and death bells, and the clock that struck all the weary hours, and the smart weddings, which served only to remind me how little chance I had of ever being married in a respectable manner, and the landlady who would come in and squat down uninvited upon the wretched sofa, until I felt tempted to ask whether the law between landlord and tenant made it her sofa or ours, and who condoled me because I must be so lonely with my books and piano, as if books and piano were not better than her Cockney company. Ah, it was a bottomless pit of squalid misery from which you rescued me. I ought to be grateful." "Don't talk about gratitude, Cora. Be happy. That is all I want of you." "I'll do my best," answered the girl briskly. "I don't know whether it is the chef or Mrs. Ricketts who makes these two delicious biscuits, but whatever hand mixes the paste, it is the hand of genius. And now I must go and give myself a warm bath, after all the mud and mire of the day's diversion, and spend an hour or so in making myself just endurable." "Put on one of your prettiest frocks," said Lady Penrith. "Mr. Coverdale is a good enough match for any young woman." "The Honourable and Reverend John Coverdale. It looks rather nice upon the address of a letter. But do you suppose for 1 minute, aunt, that a serious and cultured Anglican parson would ever look with the eye of favour upon me?" asked Cora, pausing, with her hand upon the door. "Love delights in incongruities. Mr. Coverdale is highly intellectual, and I believe both kind and conscientious. He is just the husband to reform me. Ah, aunt, if it were any use trying for him." She opened the door quickly and was gone. Lady Penrith heard her whistling a music hall melody learnt in the smoking room as she went along the corridor. "That is the warmest affection I get in this house," thought Sibyl Penrith as the notes died away in the distance. "And I wonder whether she is false or true. An Urquhart and true. That would indeed be an anomaly. But then there is the other side. Her mother may have been a good woman." She wanted to think well of this motherless girl, if she could, for pure pity, Although the girl was the daughter of that man whom she regarded as her worst enemy, the man who had turned the sweetest gift of life into bitterness and despair, she believed the worst of Hubert Urquhart, her husband's half-brother, and yet, hearing from Lord Penrith that Hubert Urquhart's daughter was living alone and neglected in a bachelor lodging-house, all her kindly instincts rose in the girl's favour, and she lay awake a whole night thinking how she could serve this unhappy waif whose misfortune it was to belong to such a father. There was one thing Lady Penrith could not do. She could not cross the threshold of any house inhabited by Hubert Urquhart. She spoke to her husband on the morning after that night of troubled thought. "I have been thinking of what you told me yesterday about your brother's girl," she began. "I don't like the idea of your niece being in such a miserable position, and if you don't object, I should like to take her to live with me. There is plenty of room for her, both here and in the country." "Yes, there is room enough, undoubtedly. We are not a large family," said Penrith, who had fretted himself with an angry wonder at the absence of an heir. 2 children had been born to him, and had died in infancy. It seemed to him that there was a curse upon his union with a woman who had never flattered him so far as to pretend she loved him. She had given him herself and her wealth, the plaything of fate, the slave of adverse circumstances, and it seemed to him, and perhaps to the wife also, that a blight had fallen upon their offspring, the withering blight of a home where love never entered. "You have no objection, then?" asked Sibyl after a pause. They were in the hall, in the great stately house near Berkeley Square, one of those few houses in West End London where rank may live within high garden walls, hidden from the outside world. The garden was gloomy, after the manner of London gardens, despite all that horticulture could do in the way of carpet beds and showy creepers. The house was grandly ugly without, and splendidly luxurious within. The wife's wealth had been spent lavishly upon that long neglected pile, and could the last Earl of Penrith have visited his town mansion, his astonished ghost would hardly have recognised the rooms which, in his own day, had been conspicuous for the shabbiness of their curtains and carpets, and for the ugliness of their furniture of the later Georgian period. Under her present ladyship's regime, the house had been furnished and decorated throughout after the fashion of Louis XVI, and it might have been the mansion entre cour et jardin of a legitimist nobleman in the Faubourg Saint-Germain. Space and light, grace of line, and the delicacy of colouring distinguished those large and lofty reception rooms, that airy hall with its double sweep of shallow marble stairs, its groups of palms and gracious marble forms of faun and nymph, Cupid and Psyche. Penrith paced up and down the hall with an inscrutable countenance. He was a man in whom speech seemed in some wise an effort. "You won't mind my having your niece as a kind of companion, will you, Penrith?" urged his wife. "Mind? No, of course not. It is very good of you to suggest the thing. All I fear is that the girl may prove a bore to you." And so the matter was settled, and Coralie Urquhart was transferred, with her meagre belongings, from the shabby second floor in Jermyn Street to Penrith House, where there was room and verge enough to allow this young lady her own sitting-room, as well as a spacious bed and dressing-room. She declared that she felt like a princess amidst her new surroundings, and so much so the more after Madame Lelotte, her ladyship's dressmaker, had taken her measure for a complete set of frocks and outdoor garments to suit all the requirements of her new life. Sibyl was far too delicate to suggest any overhauling of the girl's existing wardrobe, but a few judicious questions elicited the fact that Miss Urquhart possessed exactly 5 frocks, 3 tailor-made and threadbare, while the remaining 2 were evening gowns a year and a half old and too small to be worn without torture. The Potter's tailor gave me a start with these nice little tweed frocks when I came from Paris, but he has turned disagreeable since then and won't give me any more tick. Carly was mildly reproved for that last word, and Madame Lelotte was sent for and told that she must produce a season's dresses for Miss Urquhart before the end of the week. She shrugged her shoulders and elevated her eyebrows, then exhibited all her neat little teeth in a caressing smile. Pour milady, on fait l'impossible, she said. Mais, mon Dieu, 4 jours pour faire un trousseau. And the result of the impossible was done, so far as the production of 2 delicious little walking gowns and 3 party frocks of a most exquisite simplicity, yet with a certain boldness of style and colouring, which set off Miss Urquhart's plainness. Elle est franchement laide, la petite, the dressmaker told Lady Penrith's maid at a later interview. But it is an original style of ugliness, and I like it better than your milky-skinned English, with their faces in papier-mâché. Henceforth, Coralie's life was a bed of roses, or would have been, had she been without conscience and without heart. Unluckily for her, she had not yet attained that hardness which rises superior to all moral feelings, all vain compunctions. But she was her father's daughter, and she was in a fair way of becoming like him. He had a serious conversation with her the night before she left him to become a member of his brother's family. "Cora," he said thoughtfully, lying back in the one comfortable armchair which his landlady provided for her victims, and smoking his favourite briarwood, "you and I are not likely to see much of each other while you are under Lady Penrith's protection." "Why not?" she asked wonderingly. "Because her ladyship hates me like poison. Never mind why she hates me. It is an old story, and a long one. I don't reciprocate the feeling, and I am profoundly interested in the lady and all that concerns her. By the way, do you keep a diary? Of course, most girls do." "Do they? Well, they must have more to write about than I have since I left Madame Michau's. What should I put down? Tuesday. Poured out father's coffee. Went for a walk in the Green Park with the landlady's daughter. Began another novel, rather stupider than the last. Why does Mudie send one of the books one doesn't ask for instead of the book one has been wanting for the last 3 weeks? Went to bed at 11:30. Father had not come home. Do you think that sort of record would be worth keeping?" "Happy the woman who has no history," answered her father sententiously. "Well, you will keep a diary in the future, if you please, Cora, and you will keep it in such a manner as you will admit of your allowing me to read it. You will have plenty to record at Penrith House and Killander Castle. You will have her ladyship, a most interesting study, a poem and history incarnate. I want you to observe her closely, and to write down everything that concerns her actions, sentiments, opinions, the people with whom she associates, and the esteem in which she holds them." "Father," said Cora, looking at him with wide-open eyes and hardening lips, more earnestly than she had ever looked at him in her life before, "you want me to be a spy." "No, my dear. I only want you to be an observer. My interest in Lady Penrith is founded on the purest motives. I want to put an end to the feud between us, which is perilous for her and unpleasant for me. I know her miserably mated to my brother, who is, well, about as bad as they make 'em," continued Urquhart, taking refuge in slang, "and I have no doubt I could be of use to her in the future, financially, in the protection of her fortune, and otherwise, and I can only serve her by watchfulness, personal or vicarious. It is just possible that this kindness to you means a change of feeling towards me, a holding out of the olive branch. So much the better if it does. But in any case, you must watch for me, since I can't watch for myself. And you will find out her friends and her enemies, and on which side the peril lies." "Will you assure me that you are her friend, and that no harm can come of anything I may tell you?" "I do assure you that I am her friend. I will go further and tell you that 10 years ago I was her adoring lover. She refused me. Her heart was buried in another man's grave, and a few months afterwards she married my elder brother. The match was of old Joseph Higginson's making, I have no doubt. She accepted a coronet. With a wry face, perhaps, but accepted it all the same, as women do. The old romantic feeling of mine died out long ago, but Sybil Penrith is still a great deal nearer and dearer to me than any other woman, and I should like to help her if she ever has need of help. She is too rich not to be robbed. She is too handsome not to be tempted. You will be with her in a confidential capacity. You are keen enough to scent either danger and to pass the warning on to me. You can send me your diary weekly." "I can't understand how you can be any use to her." "I don't ask you to understand," replied Mr. Urquhart with admirable nonchalance, puffing quietly at his briarwood. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 2. Cora's Diary. I hardly know how I should dispose of my evening hours at Callander Castle, if my father had not imposed this task of diary-keeping upon me. My aunt leaves the drawing-room as the clock strikes 10. I don't believe she goes to bed before midnight. But as she has never invited me to a causerie in her room, and as she always wishes me a distinct good night in the gallery where we light our candles, I feel that solitude is my portion, and that I am left to my own resources till the next morning. I have always been a wretched sleeper, and one of my worst miseries in Madame Michon's was to hear the church clock chime the quarters all through the long, dreary night, perhaps until 5 o'clock in the morning, when I dropped into the slumber of sheer exhaustion, and dreamt dreams that were darkened with the consciousness that the dressing bell would ring at 6, and that I must be dressed and in the classroom at the 6:45. Oh, weary servitude! Oh, joyless days and restless nights! When I find the wheels of life dragging somewhat heavily at Killander Castle, let me remember the dreary round of school work, and the scanty fare of the school table, the burden of too frequent church services, and the ever-present consciousness that I was the worst dressed girl in the school, and that my bills were always in arrear. I must, however, admit that Madame Michon treated me fairly and kindly after her lights, considering that she stood in danger of losing by me. It was Madame Michon's pupils, on whom my poverty inflicted no inconvenience, who made me feel the agony of being poor. If I had not been the niece of an earl, I think they would have trampled upon me. My blue blood went for something, and I took an aggressive attitude against every girl who represented the wealth made in commerce. Well, that is an old song. Thank heaven, and Lady Penrith and I am here in this Cumbrian castle, lapped in luxury, with fine raiment in my wardrobe, and plenty of pocket money, and if the life is rather dull now and then, I am not the less grateful to Providence and my uncle's wife. As for my uncle himself, of whose race I am, and on whom alone I have any claim, he throws me a word now and then, as he might throw a biscuit to one of his spaniels, and cares less, I fancy, what may become of me than what may become of the dog. He is a curious man, handsome in a certain faded style, like the portrait of an old master that has been spoilt in the cleaning. He is straight as a dart, tall, and well set up. He is said to have the grand manner, which I take to be a manner of caring for nobody in the world but oneself. At 10 o'clock my aunt bids me good night in the long gallery leading to her rooms, and I cross the head of the great staircase, and retire to my own den to yawn over a novel or to write my diary till midnight. Inclination would take me to the smoke-room, where I believe I should not be altogether unwelcome, for the men must have exhausted their stock of improper anecdotes by 10 o'clock, and must have begun to grow tired of their own society. They have told me severally, and on different occasions, that I am good fun. How much I should prefer being good fun downstairs in that comfortable billiard-room to moping up here over a dull novel, or my still duller diary. The proprieties forbid me masculine society after 10 o'clock. So to thee, O diary, I turn, and try to interest myself in a study of character, Lady Penrith's character in particular. There is a certain fascination, I find, even in the dullest diary, when it is about oneself, one's own feelings, likes and dislikes, odd fancies, rebellious promptings against fate and Mrs. Grundy. But it is not so interesting when one writes about other people. My father honoured me by expressing a desire to read my jottings about her ladyship. I have, therefore, commenced a system of diary-keeping by double entry. What I mean him to read, I write in one volume. My own little reveries I keep to myself in another volume. I suppose he really was in love with Lady Penrith years ago when I was a child, moping my little life away in the depths of Yorkshire with my middle-class maiden aunts. Yes, I suppose he was really and honestly in love with her, and not attached to her only on account of her wealth. And yet I can hardly imagine my father a romantic lover, caring for anything above and beyond his own interest. There is a hardness about him, just as there is about his lordship, and which should call the Urquhart hardness, for I can see the same character indicated in many of the family portraits on these walls, a cold, calm concentration of purpose, which I take to mean absolute selfishness. Yet it may be that even a man of that hard nature may be moved to forget himself by such a woman as Sybil Penrith in the flush of her girlish beauty. She is absolutely beautiful now at 29. She took me to 3 very big parties before we left London, and she was the handsomest woman amidst a crowd where I felt to be plain was to be conspicuous. Yes, any man might have loved and suffered for such a woman, only I think Sir Joseph Higginson's coal pits would have more attraction for my father than the loveliest face that ever shone upon mankind. In any case, I can understand what a bitter blow it must have been to him when she married his elder brother. I wonder who the man was who died, the man she loved, the man in whose grave her heart is buried. Who was he, and where is that grave where her heart lies dead and cold? Yes, I believe her heart is with the dead. She goes through life like an animated statue, coldly beautiful, benevolent, charitable, religious, polite, and amiable to a most unsympathetic husband, fulfilling all the duties of that station to which it has pleased God to call her, and, if I read her right, caring for nothing in the world except her books and piano. So much for my private opinions and speculations in Volume 2, and now for my observations upon life in general and Lady Penrith in particular in Volume 1, which, if my father insists, I shall allow him to peruse. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Thou Art the Man. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Thou Art the Man by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Chapter 3. Cora's Diary for paternal perusal. We have been at Callander Castle for more than 2 months, and there has not been an event worth recording, or indeed any circumstance that can be honoured with the name of an event, till this afternoon. The life here since the beginning of August has been as luxuriously monotonous as life on Tennyson's Lotus Island, only we have not enjoyed such a climate as tempted Ulysses and his companions to a perpetual repose. The weather has been distinctly British. His lordship spent the latter half of August and a great part of September in Scotland, shooting. He arrived here the end of last month, bringing a few friends with him for more shooting. My aunt declined Scotland for this autumn. She wanted nothing but rest after a busy season. Calander is her most established home. Here she has her largest collection of books and music, her favourite Broadwood, her finest garden and hothouses. Here, in short, she has all the things in which a great lady with an empty heart can take delight. Here, too, she is within a drive or even a long walk of the house in which she was born, and the village where she knows every cottage and most of the inhabitants, from the bent old grandfather to the year-old baby. I have done a great deal of cottage visiting with her since we came here, and I must confess that I find cottagers with their everlasting woes and incurable ailments utterly insupportable, and I am puzzled to understand the order of intellect which can take pleasure in personal contact with them. To relieve their wants is a duty and an inclination which I can understand in a person as rich as Lady Penrith, who can never feel any poorer for her beneficence. But surely there are clergymen's wives and sisterhoods and people that one could employ for all this dismal, uninteresting work, instead of bothering about every detail of every old woman's miserable existence, as my aunt does. However, all this twaddle seems to interest her, and I have to sit or stand by while she listens to long rigmaroles about rheumatics, or sick children, or drinking husbands, or sons out of work, or daughters that have gone wrong. It is one treadmill round of human misery, to be mitigated by doles of such miserable amount taken in relation to her ladyship's wealth, that they really might just as well be distributed by a bailiff or homely drudge of a curate's wife. Why Lady Penrith should amuse herself by sympathizing, or pretending to sympathize, for it can't be real, with all those squalid miseries, I can no more understand than I can fathom the minds of those women who get up at 6:30 every morning to attend matins, when they might enjoy the best hour of the day, the hour between waking and getting up, with a cup of strong tea and a volume of Guy de Maupassant stories. I have never allowed my ennui or my sentiments to escape during the frequent martyrdom of this cottage visiting. Far from it. I shake the dirtiest paws, sip the vilest tea, and win all hearts with my jolly good fellow manner, which has given the cottagers the idea that, however sternly conservative the castle may be, Miss Urquhart is, at heart, a radical. Sometimes I have been tempted into wondering whether all this active benevolence, this sympathy with the sick and sorrowing poor, may not be a self-imposed penance on the part of Lady Penrith, the expiation of her maturer years for some sin of her girlhood. Yet I cannot think that this passionless nature ever deviated from the straight path. Her character must have always been spotless, superior to every temptation. And again, for a woman born rich, there are so few temptations, and Satan must offer so choice a bait when he fishes for the rich man's soul. What other idiosyncrasies besides this regard for the poor that I have observed in my aunt's character? First, her love of music, which amounts to a passion. Secondly, her love of books, which astonishes me, books not at all being in my way. I never read a book when I can get a newspaper, and I infinitely prefer Truth and the World to any of the authors who are called classics. Nor do I see that book learning is of the slightest use to any young woman who does not want to write school books or go out as a governess. The little I have seen of masculine society has shown me that men detest culture in a woman. The men who go in for learning themselves hate a rival in their own field. Scholars don't want sympathy from women. They want blind admiration. And the average man, a monster of ignorance about everything that is not in the newspapers, shrinks from a well-informed woman as from a drawing-room pestilence. To please the sterner sex, a woman should know just enough of politics to be able to listen intelligently to the old fogies and middle-aged bores, and enough about sport and society scandals to be able to carry out a touch-and-go conversation with a young man of average intellect. She may say a smart thing now and then, but she must never pretend to be a wit. She must accept her position as man's inferior and honor and revere her sultan. If my father favors me by reading the last remarks, he will perceive that I have taken his lessons in worldly wisdom to heart, and that I am studying how to please a potential husband. There is one here, Mr. Coverdale, Lord Workington's only son, who would be worth pleasing. But alas, alas, penniless and plain, must shoot at lesser game. To return to Lady Penrith. She is a reading woman, and her morning room is lined with books, all of her own collection, and entirely distinct from the orthodox library of standard authors on the ground floor. I amused myself a few days ago, while I was waiting to go out driving with her, by a careful study of these books. I have been told to study the lady's character, and some part of her character must reveal itself in the books she chooses. I found poetry strongly represented by poets, old and new. Byron, Shelley, Keats, Browning, and Tennyson are lavishly spread along the shelves in various editions, with a richness of binding and variety of style that mark the lady's appreciation. Milton and Shakespeare are equally honored. The poets fill a large section of the bookcases near the fireplace, and on this side of the room my aunt has her favorite armchair, tea table, and Japanese screen. If anything could make me fond of reading, it would be such a room as this. The novelists are here also: Scott, Dickens, Thackeray, Lytton, George Eliot, and here and there a volume by a lesser light. Then come biography, history, criticism, and metaphysics. My aunt seems to have taken all learning for her province, as somebody says of himself. One block of books especially interested me, for they suggested a warm interest in a subject which I should consider very remote from Lady Penrith's line of thought. On the shelves below the poets, and within reach of her hand, as she sits in her low bergère, I found a collection of books on African travel and African sport, from Livingstone downwards. I never saw so many books on one subject in any library I ever looked at. I asked myself, with natural wonder, how and why a woman who is utterly indifferent to sport in England and Scotland should be so keenly interested in sport in Africa, and why a woman who has travelled very little in Europe should be interested in books of travel in that uncivilized quarter of the globe. The only answer to the riddle which offers itself to my mind is that the lady's interest in Africa is vicarious, and that the man to whom she gave her heart in youth was in some manner associated with the dark continent. I have found her poring over Burton or Cameron, Stanley or Baker in the lazy hour between afternoon tea and the dressing bell. I once ventured to ask her how she could find amusement in books which to me appeared essentially dull and dry. She looked up with her sweet smile and answered, There is not a single page in these books without interest for me, Cora. And you would like to travel in Africa? Dearly. Why don't you, then? She gave a faint sigh before she answered, Hardly any woman could run the risks and endure the hardships to which these men exposed themselves, and if any woman could, the world would not let her do it. My duties are at home. Were I you, I would hold every duty subordinate to my own whim, said I. If I wanted to roam about African deserts and ride across African swamps and see the falls of the Zambezi or the mountains of the moon, nothing should prevent me. I would defy opinion, as Lady Hester Stanhope did. I like to tease her about her wealth and its omnipotence sometimes. I think it is the sting of conscious poverty which goads me to remind her what a power she possesses and how poor a use she makes of it. How deeply sad her face was while she spoke of Africa. Yes, that is the charm. Her lover must have been a wanderer in those wild pathways. That next time I find myself alone in her morning room, I made a further examination of her African collection. I looked for any volumes by less familiar names, thinking that among these I might find some book written by the man she loved. Very few men travel much in strange lands without delivering themselves of a book. Sooner or later, the thirst for paper and print takes possession of them. They hunt up their old journals and random records of sport and eke out their own scanty materials with plagiarism from Burton or Stanley. I found one volume, a thinnish octavo, which attracted me for two reasons. First, it was more delicately bound than any of the other books. Secondly, it showed signs of having been more read. The title was unpretentious, My African Apprenticeship. The name of the author was Braddon Mountford. The year of publication, 1874, just 12 years ago. On the fly-leaf I found a brief inscription. From B.M. to S.H., May 6th, 1876. B.M., of course, stands for the author, S.H. for Sybil Higginson. It was not until the following year that Sir Joseph Higginson's daughter became Lady Penrith. Dear little book, to give me such precise information about yourself. B.M. to S.H. Only a lover would write thus. Anyone upon ceremonious terms would have written from the author. I looked into the pages. The usual thing. Descriptions of scenery, descriptions of storms, sunsets, sunrises, aurora borealis, wonderful effects of sky, perils of being eaten by savages or wild beasts, perils of having nothing to eat, lion shooting, fever, friendly natives. Nothing of personal history to tell me what manner of man Braddon Mountford was. But that vellum-bound book, with its delicately tooled edges and gold lettering, and with leaves that open so easily, with here and there a rose petal or withered violet, told me one fact for certain. Whatever B.M. may have been, saint or sinner, Sybil Higginson loved him, and Sybil Penrith cherishes his memory. Oh, irony of fate, that one woman should own over 1 million and sit in her lonely room brooding over a dead man's book, while thousands of women in the world are striving and wrestling to get themselves decently married for the sake of food and raiment, a shelter and a fireside. Had I a 10th part of Lady Penrith's money, what a variety of pleasures, excitements, and enjoyments I would wring out of this brief existence of ours. I peeped into the billiard room after lunch today and saw Mr. Coverdale knocking about the balls by himself in a low-spirited way, so I lingered in the room for a few minutes, looking for last week's punch, and presently he invited me to play a 50 with him. He is a poor player, and I am a poor player, though I have done my possible to make up for the deficiencies of my education by playing whenever anybody condescends to ask me, and by practicing whenever I can get the table to myself. The 50 took a longish time, for besides our slow scoring, the Honourable and Reverend John was in an expansive humour and talked a good deal about his views, which are ritualistic to a degree that verges on Romanism. I humoured him to the utmost. Indeed, in religious matters I am ritualistic if I am anything, and we had a really interesting conversation in which I seemed to get more in sympathy with this cold pattern of propriety than I ever have been before. Indeed, as we put our cues into the rack, he made me a little reproachful speech, which was, to my mind, a compliment. "You are like St. Paul, at least in one attribute, Miss Urquhart," he said. "You can be all things to all men. No one who heard you talking slang with the shooters yesterday would anticipate your delightful conversation today. Now observe, O author of my being, that your daughter's delightful conversation had chiefly consisted in holding her tongue. I had let him talk, and only said just so much as was necessary to lead him on to descant at large upon the theme he loves. Intelligent listening means sympathy, comprehension, everything to a talking man. The clock struck 3. My aunt generally drives out at 3 o'clock, and as a rule I go with her. It is one of my duties or privileges, whichever I like to call it. I rushed up to my room and put on a jacket and hat, snatched a pair of gloves, and flew downstairs to the hall and out to the great flight of steps which approached this stately castle. The barouche was at the door, and my aunt was already seated in it. At the sight of my flying figure on the steps, the footman descended from his perch and opened the carriage door. In another minute I was seated at her ladyship's side. "I did not know you were coming with me, Cora," she said, and I detected a shade of annoyance in her tone. Offended at my unpunctuality, no doubt, thought I, but it struck me afterwards that upon this particular afternoon she wanted to be alone. I apologized for my late appearance, and she affected an interest in my account of Mr. Coverdale's conversation, but I could see that her mind was otherwhere, and she spoke at random. We drove to Cargill, a village on the seaward side of the great dreary moor which separates Killander Castle from the civilized world northward of its walls. Her ladyship stopped the carriage at the first house at the village. "I am going to some of the cottages, Cora," she said, "but I shan't stay in any of them. Would you like to sit in the carriage till I have done? There is the 19th Century to amuse you." She pointed to a half-cut magazine on the empty seat. I hate those learned periodicals which presuppose a corresponding erudition on the part of the reader, and the notion that Lady Penrith did not want my company gave a stimulus to my curiosity. I jumped out of the carriage with alacrity. "I had much rather see your cottagers than read the 19th Century," said I. We went into several cottages, with the usual results. Ailments, rheumatic and internal, sore legs, swollen faces, all the disagreeables of life, sons out of work, husbands given to drink, the old, old story. My aunt was sympathetic, took note of all necessities, and promised relief. In all this I could see nothing out of the beaten track, but I observed that in every cottage she asked the same questions about a man she had seen upon the moor on the previous afternoon, a man who looked like a shepherd, very ragged and poor, and, as she thought, not altogether right in his mind. No one was able to identify the person she described, though many suggestions, more or less wide of the mark, were offered. She exhibited wonderful pertinacity in this inquiry. We went from hovel to hovel till I was heartily sick of the subject. What did I care for a ragged man who was or was not of weak intellect? "I should like to help this poor creature," said my aunt, and she charged every one of whom she inquired to make it his or her business to find this ragged personage, in order that he might be clothed and put in the way of being restored to his right mind. "Is there any asylum for lunatics in the neighbourhood from which the man could have escaped?" she asked of an elderly woman who had given more signs of intelligence than the other aboriginals she had questioned. "None nearer than Durrock, and that's a good 40 mile from here." The search was evidently hopeless, and my aunt's benevolent intentions were to bear no fruit. The afternoon was cold and windy, with that parching east wind which is harmful alike to complexion and temper. I felt my nose was blue, and I knew I was in a very acrimonious state of mind. The change from stuffy cottages to the bleak outer air was too trying to have been patiently endured by a saint. Yet Lady Penrith seemed alike unconscious of the nipping cold outside and of the frowsy warmth within. Not contented with this wearisome house-to-house inquiry, she drove a long round on her way home in order to repeat her questions at every half a dozen isolated cottages, and it was nearly dark before the towering bulk of the Penrith's stronghold appeared across the grey distance. I never look at that medieval castle without a faint pang of envy which no amount of recently acquired wealth, much as I adore money, could inspire. That legacy of past ages stirs the small modicum of romance in my nature. I envy Lady Penrith in the possession of that fine old fortress, and I am proud to think that I am one of the race whose forebears held it in the days when every great nobleman was a warrior chieftain, and proud to think that I am descended from ancestors who fought for king and country when England was young and bold and warlike, rather than from some plodding lawyer who won his peerage in the dust and din of the law courts and by subserviency to the powers that be. So you see, father, you who are of the world worldly, there is a thin thread of romance still running through the warp and weft of your daughter's character. All your lessons in the craft that rules mankind have not extinguished my reverence for the past, and my belief in the value of ancient lineage, a value in one's own secret estimate of oneself, the feeling that, come what may, one is better than the ruck of mankind, better inherently by superiority which dates from the Crusades, and which no achievement of newly made wealth can cancel. I contrived to suppress all demonstrations of vexation during that long, cold drive with its circuitous extensions, but I could not restrain my curiosity. "You must have some special reason for being interested in this ragged man, I should think, aunt, by your earnestness in searching for him," I said, when we had turned our backs upon a wretched stone hovel half hidden in a dip of the moor. "You are right, Cora. I have a reason," she answered quietly, and in a tone that forbade further questioning. I hugged myself in my sealskin jacket and muff. her gifts, and I told myself I must wait for the time and chance to show me the nature of her reason. It must be a very strong one, if I have any power to read her face. All the resources of my intelligence are henceforth pledged to the solution of this social mystery. I have very little to think about now that the all-absorbing question of ways and means has been made easy for me, and for want of interest in my own insignificant existence, I am naturally thrown upon speculations about my aunt. If John Coverdale would only condescend to fall in love with me, life would take different colors, would change from dull, uniform gray to the brilliant variety of the rainbow. Not that I am in love with that handsome pattern of propriety, mark you, but every girl wants a lover. The conquest of man is woman's mission, the only mission worth a woman's thought, and not to be admired and loved is to be outside the pale. I am plain, let me not forget that. Plain, but not repulsive. I have good eyes and teeth, and you have told me that my face lights up when I talk, and that my complexion improves by candlelight, and that I have a quality which you call chien, and which is not without its charm for the opposite sex, especially the duller members of that sex, who are apt to be caught by smartness and gumption in a woman. This much of praise have you given me, oh, my father, in the course of our conversations across the morning coffee and rasher. Am I smart? Have I gumption, I wonder? I recall the stories I have heard of plain women and their conquests, and it appears to me that the unbeautiful have been very often winners in the race. One hears of men who forsake lovely wives to go to perdition for plain and even elderly mistresses. One hears of men who line their bachelor rooms with pictures of beautiful women, who go about declaring that only perfect loveliness can charm them, and who unite themselves in lifelong union with sallow complexions and snub noses. I will remember all these anomalies when I am inclined to despair of my own fortunes, and in the meantime I will devote my leisure to the study of my aunt's character. She has been very good to me, and I ought to love her dearly. There are times when I tell myself that I do so love her, and then perhaps a cold wave of doubt comes over me. She is so handsome, so calm and self-possessed. She has been so favored by fortune and nature in all those respects where I have been hardly used. Is it human in me to love her? More especially when I much doubt if she has any affection for me. She is a woman whose life is ruled by fixed principles and ideas. I believe she endures me and protects me, just as she goes to church on bleak, uncomfortable mornings, because the thing is a duty and has to be done. End of chapter 3.